Thank you so much, Steve. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. Is the sound okay? Everyone here is all right? All right, good. So I am delighted to be here at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, and I am very much looking forward to the conversation that we'll have tonight. We are meeting at a time when it has become ever more obvious that American politics are in crisis in Washington and in the states. A government that is supposed to be of, by, and for the people is in crisis. Even elementary norms of civic decency and truth are now in crisis. You know this, I'm sure. I know that you've been paying attention. But what you might be struggling to figure out is how we got here and what it means. The watershed that we've now reached in our public life has been fed by many streams, of course, some of which have received extensive attention from scholars and journalists. Those streams include the kind of movement conservatism that made Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate for president soon after he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Another and related stream is the religious right. And there is the white supremacist right that has resurfaced with a vengeance of late. All of these are important, all of these have extensive scholarly trails, and all of them have also helped produce the votes needed to effect radical policy change. But I'm here tonight to tell you about another piece of the puzzle of how we got into the dangerous situation in which we now find ourselves, a missing piece. And that is the ideas that are guiding the billionaire-funded libertarian right made famous by Charles Koch. And I believe it's the missing piece, a crucial piece that we've missed because it explains so much that otherwise remains mysterious. It's also crucial because knowing about this piece may equip citizens, like all of you here tonight, to lead the way out of this mess before it is too late. As a public health nurse who read the book and wrote to me expressed it, you need to get the diagnosis right before you can determine the best treatment plan. Because there's an unmarked hazard in our situation right now. The noisiest threats are getting the most attention. Among them, I'm sad to say, the chronic race baiting and bullying coming from the White House. But as that spectacle draws nearly all media and voter attention, an even more extreme plan is proceeding apace. In the 30 states now totally dominated by this cause, in federal and state agencies, and in the courts. This plan is being pursued by a much smaller cause, but one that is archly determined and breathtakingly well-funded. More than that, this cause has shown that it is willing to use those other popular sections of the right, particularly the religious right, but also the white supremacist right, to get what its members want. I'll state my case simply. Behind all the seeming chaos and dysfunction in our public life right now, there is a strategy in play, a cold-eyed, calculated strategy. And that strategy is far along. One of its field generals said this in late 2015, and I quote, "We're close to winning," he said. They, meaning the critics, or you could say the rest of the American citizenry, don't have the real path. They don't have the real path. That was Mark Holden, the head of Koch Industries' government and public affairs operation, gloating to an invitation-only audience of billionaire and multimillionaire donors. Now, you've heard a lot in the last several years, and probably read a lot, too, about the fortune that Charles Koch has been investing in our politics. But what you have likely not heard is about the ideas, the technology, as Koch refers to them. This is a man with 3 engineering degrees from MIT. He tends to speak of ideas as technology. But what you've probably not heard about is these ideas that have made the recent investments so devastatingly effective. It was an academic economist I learned through my research who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism of the kind they favored to thrive, democracy must be enchained. So my book, Democracy in Chains, provides the unknown backstory of this defining moment in which we find ourselves, as it uncovers that real path to which Mark Holden referred. In its essence, it is the story of two men, a thinker and a CEO, whose lives converged through a shared commitment to transform the model of government that our country built up over the course of the 20th century through citizen pressure. The thinker was a Tennessee-born economist, James McGill Buchanan, who spent most of his career in Virginia institutions. And the CEO is, of course, the Kansas-based Charles Koch, who spent most of his adult life, when he wasn't building Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, spent most of his adult leisure, I should say, seeking a way to make our country, and the world, in fact, and I'll come back to that, conform to his arch vision of economic liberty, a kind of free-rein capitalism beyond the reach of voters and their governments. The history my book conveys is, first of all, of the crucible in which this idea of enchaining democracy to insulate economic liberty, of the crucible in which Buchanan came up with this idea, and that was as the civil rights movement made headway in Virginia and the nation in the late 1950s and 1960s. And then it is a story about how Charles Koch funded an apparatus to make that idea of enchaining democracy a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the volatile situation we are now confronted with. It's not a comforting story, I have to admit. Several readers have compared it to a Stephen King novel. I've not read any Stephen King novels, but I took their point. But I also believe, both as a scholar and a citizen, that knowing what we are really up against is vital to assessing how best to defend a democracy that many of us now can see is facing existential threat. Knowledge can be empowering, I believe that. And that's also what I'm hearing back from readers who say things like, as one wrote, "It feels like the curtain has been pulled back, and now we can finally see what has really been going on." But now, having shared this with you, rather than lecture in a conventional way, what I wanted to do was share with you how I stumbled on the trail that led me to these conclusions. Because knowing the route that led me to the conclusions I've just stated will give you, I believe, an even sharper sense of the stakes of all of this. Because it turns out that this is not the first time that the libertarian right has shown itself willing to exploit white supremacy to advance the cause of what I've come to think of as property supremacy. A property supremacy that will affect all of us, whatever we look like and whatever our backgrounds are. The trail that led me to these conclusions also reveals the surprising role that some scholars and universities have played in bringing us to this point, and I think that's a history that all of us in educational settings need to reckon with, so I hope we'll be able to have some discussion about that tonight too. So then, what led me to these stark conclusions? In a word, serendipity. I'm actually a historian of American social movements, with a particular interest in the US South. And about 10 years ago, I had just finished a book, and I came across the tragic tale of Prince Edward County, Virginia, whose white officials answered the US Supreme Court's call to desegregate the county's public schools without further delay by, as the county leaders put it, and I quote, "going out of the public school business entirely." They shuttered their entire public school system. They even posted no trespassing signs, and they left black children with no formal education whatsoever, while the county's white children headed off to private segregation academies with state-subsidized tuition grants, what we would today call vouchers. And these county officials, in the name of state sovereignty and individual liberty, kept the schools shut for 5 years until the courts compelled them to reinstate a school system. Shocked by what I saw in the archives and deeply moved by the stories of these children and their families and the civil rights workers who came from elsewhere to help them, I started to research this story. And very quickly, I found that these tax-funded school vouchers were crucial to the story of what happened in Prince Edward and actually in the wider South in Virginia. And I also learned that the Chicago free market economist, Milton Friedman, had issued his first manifesto calling for tax-funded school vouchers for private schools in 1955, in the full knowledge of how those vouchers would be used in the South. But in following a footnote, I learned of a 1959 report as this Prince Edward County threat was in the air because they didn't close the schools until the fall of September 1959 when they were going to face a desegregation order. This 1959 report came from two other economists who had set up a new center for political economy and social philosophy, they called it, at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1956. And one of them was James McGill Buchanan. The report of these two economists attempted to refute the moderate white parents who were mobilizing to save Virginia's public school system by making a case that if the state sold off its public school facilities and resources to private operators, it could provide better education without having to obey the courts. Their report, in effect, called for privatizing Virginia's public education system before we had that verb to privatize. And they did so in the full knowledge that the schools thus funded would be white segregation academies because those were the only public schools in question. Black parents and their organizations opposed these tax-funded vouchers to a person, seeing them as an insult to their dignity as full citizens. Now, needless to say, it stunned me as a university professor to see two university professors making a case for what their state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it intrigued me that they did so not in racist terms, but in economic terms, leveraging the authority of their discipline to back up what the most extreme anti-democratic figures of their day were calling for. Professors Buchanan and Nutter knew that they were exploiting the rage of white supremacists to move their libertarian economic agenda, one they referred to as the free society and liberty, even as they showed no sympathy whatsoever for the civil rights activists whose mantra was freedom now. Their cover letter to the state legislators to whom they sent their report, and the particular one I found went to the state legislator who had sponsored 5 laws against the NAACP, depriving its members of their First Amendment freedoms under the Bill of Rights. Their cover letter said that they were making their case, quote, letting the chips fall where they may. Letting the chips fall where they may. And in other words, these professors were acting with full awareness of the harm their actions would inflict, particularly on Black children and their communities, but also on the wider public school system in Virginia. And as an educator myself, I wondered how someone could do such a thing, not in an irrational frenzy like some of the people in Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia were doing, but in cold-eyed calculation. My curiosity piqued, I began to seek more information about this Buchanan. And I learned that he had won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. He was awarded the prize for having pioneered a new way of thinking called public choice economics, which I learned also became very influential in the discipline of political science and in legal studies in some places, and among activists and elected officials on the right. What Buchanan did that was new, I learned, and I'm sure you haven't heard of him, most of you, I had not heard of him when I started this research, but what he did that was new in his phrase was the economic analysis of politics. But it was a peculiar kind of economic analysis, not like that of, say, Charles Beard or Karl Marx or others over the years who had looked at politics through an economic and social lens. Buchanan applied Chicago-style libertarian economics to political actors to argue that they could only be understood as individuals rationally seeking their own personal self-interest, not the common good, as they claimed. And that led him to a new explanation of deficits that proved persuasive to many because he made sense of why governments would overspend in times of prosperity, not just in times of recession or depression. And Buchanan's specialty, in fact, was public finance, which meant he was deeply concerned with questions of taxation and public spending. And also, as a thinker who identified with the right, his mission was to find ways to lower taxes and reduce the public sector. With this public choice economics, he turned new attention to what he liked to call the rules of the game in politics, to the spending incentives of the political process, and to how altering the rules of the process could yield different outcomes. And I'll say here that these ideas have since interested people who are not on the right, among them Cass Sunstein, a Harvard Law professor who worked on regulatory matters under President Obama, and others. But Buchanan's version, what came to be known as the Virginia School of Political Economy, was always distinctive. Buchanan himself said, looking back in a documentary in 2007, that his goal was, and I quote, to tear down the very idea of the public interest. He said, this hypocrisy of calling something the public interest, that's what I was trying to tear down. Again, I thought, why would anyone want to do that? Reading more, I learned that to a libertarian like Buchanan, there is no common good. Any such notion of public interest or common good will lead government to coerce those who don't agree with the majority. Democracy, Buchanan and his colleagues came to argue, violates the individual liberty of the minority. And the minority he was always most concerned with over the years was that of wealthy taxpayers and corporations that didn't share the majority's view of the public interest. Government, Buchanan and his colleagues argued, all but steals the property of such people. If it taxes them for purposes they don't share. We are not our brother's keeper, he insisted, or at least we shouldn't be allowed to use government to shift tax revenues from one citizen to another. And he came to talk about all this in very stark and foreboding terms that are now widespread on the right, not just in the US, but internationally, owing to decades of inculcation by Buchanan's team and the think tanks with which they worked. A case in point, many of you may remember when Mitt Romney told a dinner of donors in 2012 when he spoke disdainfully of what he called the 47% of Americans he said would never vote for him because they were too dependent on government. Millions of people were shocked by that. But Romney was not offering a new idea there. By then, the Heritage Foundation was maintaining an annual index of dependency, as they called it, based on this public choice economics. But it was really Buchanan who gave scholarly imprimatur to such thinking. And he spoke by the 1970s of net tax recipients, people who gained more from government than they paid in taxes, as, and I quote, parasites on the productive, end quote. He also warned of, again I'm quoting, predators and prey, employing what I think you can see is the dehumanizing vocabulary that makes fellow citizens who need or want to turn to government for assistance with some purpose, making them appear as menaces from the animal world. As someone who has worked on the long history of the right, including the extreme right and the Ku Klux Klan, I can tell you that this is a vocabulary that is disinhibiting. It is a vocabulary that licenses hostility. And it is a vocabulary that is rife on the American right today. And when some people talk about draining the swamp, they're not talking about what liberals think about corporate lobbyists. They're talking about this notion that so many of their fellow citizens are parasites. As I read more, I learned too that for those who think this way, justice is a simple matter. And one of Buchanan's colleagues, Walter Williams, who often appears on the Rush Limbaugh show as a guest host, he put it this way. He said, "Let me offer you my definition of social justice. I keep what I earn, you keep what you earn." He said that when he was here in North Carolina speaking for the Civitas organization as a kind of a provocation. But Buchanan did not stop with this kind of thinking. Given these beliefs and his deep moral commitment that he was right, he moved in the 1970s from scholarship to organizing. He began urging right-wing donors and companies to build up what he called a counterintelligentsia. He urged them to create what he called, again, his words, a gravy train that would, in his words, bring men into the fold, train them in a set of values, and prepare them for intellectual battle. Now, as he was organizing, trying to bring together this counterintelligentsia, he also shifted from analysis to prescription, to what he called constitutional economics. In the belief that he had developed that all existing constitutions in the world were failures for not adequately protecting the wealth of the minority from this grasping majority, he set out to design a legal regime that could protect capitalism from government, that could enshrine the rights of the wealthy minority to a degree that no society anywhere had ever done. His timing was propitious. He found an eager audience among some Latin American generals in need of a new constitution. In 1980, the military junta of General Augusto Pinochet in Chile, through its civilian partners, invited Buchanan to Santiago to try out his ideas for how to devise this kind of constitution that would protect capitalism from government. The junta of Pinochet and his fellow generals had overthrown an elected government. They had gone on to destroy all collective organizations, labor unions, senior citizens groups, student associations, journalist groups, what have you. And after having done that, they pushed through radical changes, including the privatization of Social Security, the effective privatization of public education and of healthcare. And they wanted to make sure that when Chile went back to an elected government, those changes would stay, that they would be beyond the reach of the majority to take away what they had accomplished while they were in power. And the result of those constitutional deliberations, what they called the Constitution of Liberty, is still in place today. In 2013, Michelle Bachelet, a president who was elected by 2/3 of the Chilean people on a wide-ranging reform program to deal with pent-up frustrations among people for what the regime's policies had done to their lives, including making Chile's higher education among the most expensive in the world. She came into office promising to make changes that would meet the popular demand to right this system, but she soon found out that the Constitution would not allow her to do that. She complained of what she called its authoritarian trammels, and she said that this Constitution put, in her words, locks and bolts on what government could do. Those locks and bolts were exactly what Buchanan was called in to advise on. And they have proven quite effective. And I'm sorry to report that this is not a story of purely historical interest. A constitution of locks and bolts is coming to America, thanks to pressure from the Koch donor network and its allies in the trenches, who are determined to achieve the kind of binding change that Buchanan urged without informing the public of their true goals. And I'll come back to this, but when Charles Koch set out to fund a center for Buchanan and his colleagues to push this program, this is what he said: "Since we are greatly outnumbered, the failure to use our superior technology ensures failure." So it's quite calculated and clear. And thanks to assiduous organizing by the apparatus that Koch and his fellow arch-right donors fund, Above all, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, ALEC, and a Republican Party that these donors have all but taken over and turned into a delivery vehicle thanks to the threat of primary challenges to keep any dissenters in line. This cause now has in place, with Wisconsin yesterday, 28 of the state's authorizations needed to call a constitutional convention. You need 34 states to call an Article 5 constitutional convention. They now have 28. Just to be clear, for those who haven't had their American history lately, we have not had a constitutional convention in America since 1787, when that document was crafted. To call such a convention is a very radical thing, and this effort is far along.